On a quiet Montana ranch, a man is wounded and alone, standing between danger and two children who have nowhere left to run. A young girl refuses to surrender. A sick little boy hides upstairs, and a tired German shepherd waits silently, ready to protect what remains of a broken family. There are no sirens coming, no help nearby, only a choice that will change every life in that house forever. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below, and if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe and share this story with someone who needs hope. Jericho Falls, Montana, was a small town pressed between open land and bad weather. By September, the days still held warmth, but the evenings cooled fast, and the wind moved through town as if it had somewhere better to be. Dust clung to boots and fences. People learned to lock their doors early and mind their own business. Gideon Cross lived outside town limits, where the road thinned into dirt and the prairie stretched wide and empty. His house was old but solid, built from dark wood and reinforced over the years by his own hands. The barn stood behind it, patched and uneven, but upright. Gideon kept things working. That was how he lived. Fix what breaks, don't ask for help, don't expect much. He was in his late 50s, tall, broad, and slow-moving in a way that came from habit, not age. His beard was gray and rough, trimmed short. His face was lined, his eyes pale blue and steady. People in town said Gideon was a good man, but distant. They also said he'd been different once. Years ago, sickness had taken his wife and young daughter within days. After that, Gideon stopped talking unless he had to. That evening, he stood in his kitchen as the light faded, rinsing a mug and listening to the wind hit the shutters. He was about to turn away when he heard hooves, not fast, not confident, just slow, uneven steps. Gideon set the mug down and opened the door. A girl stood on the porch. She was young, maybe 14, but she didn't carry herself like a child. Her posture was straight, alert. Her dark hair was braided loosely down her back. Her dress was worn and patched, her boots too large. In one hand she held reins. Behind her stood a thin mare, sway-backed and tired. On the horse sat a boy, small and light, his legs hanging loose. He looked around 8. His blond hair was dusty, his lips cracked. He didn't speak. He only watched Gideon carefully. "Can we sleep in your barn?" the girl asked. Her voice was calm, no begging, no explanation. Gideon's first thought was no. He lived alone. He didn't take in strangers, especially not children with no story and no adults. Jericho Falls was quiet, but the land beyond it wasn't safe. "How long since you ate?" Gideon asked. The girl stiffened. "We're fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." Gideon looked past her at the boy. His face was pale. There was sweat on his forehead despite the cool air. "He doesn't look fine." The girl glanced back at the boy, then faced Gideon again. Her grip on the reins tightened. "We won't steal," she said. "We'll be gone in the morning." The wind shifted. The horse lowered its head. "The barn's cold," Gideon said after a moment. "You won't last the night out there." The girl waited, suspicious. "There's a room inside," Gideon continued. "Used to be my daughter's." She opened her mouth, then stopped. "There's stew on the stove," Gideon added. "You'll eat before you sleep. The biz." Girl hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the windows, the yard, the road. "Why?" she asked quietly. Gideon didn't explain. He stepped aside and held the door open. "Because it's right." The girl helped the boy down from the horse. Gideon noticed how careful she was, how light the boy felt when she steadied him. "I'm Mara," she said. "This is my brother, Eli." "Ren." "Gideon," he replied. As they stepped inside, movement caught Gideon's eye. A German shepherd stood near the porch watching. The dog was large but lean, black and tan, its coat dulled by dust. One ear was notched. Its posture was calm and controlled, not aggressive. The dog walked forward and touched its nose gently to Mara's hand. She froze. Eli blinked at it. Then the dog lay down near the doorway, alert. Gideon didn't question it. "Kitchen's this way," he said. Inside, the children sat at the table stiffly. Gideon poured stew into 2 bowls. Mara waited, watching his hands. Eli ate slowly, carefully. Gideon leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Eat slow," he said. "You've been hungry." Mara nodded and followed his advice. The dog remained near the door, watching everything. Upstairs, Gideon showed them a small bedroom. The bed was made. A quilt lay folded at the foot. Mara stopped in the doorway, looking at it like it wasn't real. "You can lock the door," Gideon said. "Thank you," she replied quietly. He went back downstairs and sat by the fire, rifle nearby, listening to the wind. He told himself it was only for one night, just food, just shelter. But the house felt different already. Not loud, just occupied. And Gideon Cross knew even then that nothing about this night was simple. The house did not sleep easily that night. Gideon Cross sat in the worn wooden chair near the fireplace long after the lamps were turned low. The fire had burned down to a bed of coals, giving off just enough heat to keep the cold from settling into the bones. Outside, the wind moved across the land with a steady impatience, brushing against the walls, slipping through the smallest cracks as if testing the strength of the place. Gideon had lived with that sound for years. Tonight, it felt different. Not louder, not harsher, just more aware. Upstairs, the floor creaked softly as Mara shifted in her sleep. Gideon heard it immediately. He also heard the faint, uneven breathing of the boy, Eli, drifting down through the open stairwell. The sound was thin, strained in a way that set Gideon's jaw tight. He had heard that kind of breathing before, long ago, when he had sat beside a small bed and counted seconds between breaths, hoping the next one would come. He told himself this was nothing, just exhaustion, hunger. Children recovered from those things all the time. Still, he didn't go to bed. The German shepherd lay stretched across the threshold of the stairwell, head resting on its paws, eyes open. In the low firelight, its coat showed more clearly, black along the back, tan at the legs and face, the fur rough but clean beneath the dust. The dog looked mature, not old, likely 5 or 6 years by Gideon's guess. There was intelligence in its eyes and discipline in the way it held still, like an animal that had once known commands and purpose. It did not sleep. It watched. "You're not from around here," Gideon murmured quietly. The dog's ears flicked, but it did not move. Gideon shifted, wincing slightly as an old ache pulled at his lower back. He reached for his rifle and rested it across his knees, not because he expected trouble, but because habit had taught him that vigilance was cheaper than regret. He sat like that for hours, listening to the house settle, until the sky outside the window lightened from black to a dull, uncertain gray. Morning came without ceremony. The wind had died down, leaving the air cold and still. Gideon rose stiffly, joints protesting, and stirred the fire back to life. He set a kettle on the stove and stood waiting for it to boil, eyes drifting toward the stairs. The dog rose as well, stretching silently, then resumed its position facing upward. Mara came down first. She moved quietly, barefoot, her braid loosened and uneven. In the clearer light, Gideon could see the shadows under her eyes and the tension that never quite left her shoulders. She looked at Gideon as if measuring him all over again, reassessing what the night had changed. "Morning?" Gideon said. She nodded. "Morning. Your brother?" "He's sleeping," she replied. After a pause, she added, "He didn't sleep much." Neither did I, Gideon thought, but didn't say it. He poured hot water over coffee grounds and slid Oatse mug across the table. Mara hesitated before taking it, then wrapped both hands around it, breathing in the steam as if warmth itself were a luxury. The dog moved closer to her chair, sitting upright, alert but calm. "What's his name?" Mara asked quietly, nodding toward the dog. "I don't know," Gideon said. "He showed up with you." Mara glanced down at the dog. "He followed us yesterday, from the creek road. He didn't leave." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, restrained but pleased. "Figures," Gideon muttered. They were midway through a simple breakfast, eggs, bread, nothing fancy, when Eli's breathing changed upstairs. Gideon heard it immediately, sharper now, edged with discomfort. Mara heard it too. She was on her feet before Gideon could stand. They found Eli sitting upright in bed, face flushed, eyes unfocused. He tried to speak, failed, and swallowed hard. Gideon placed a hand against the boy's forehead. The heat was unmistakable. "He's burning up," Gideon said. Mara's mouth tightened. "He was cold all night, shaking." Gideon lifted the blanket and saw it then, the bandage wrapped clumsily around Eli's left foot, soaked through with darkened fluid. He unwound it carefully. The wound beneath was angry and swollen, red creeping up the skin. "When did this happen?" Gideon asked. Mara looked away. "Days ago, maybe more." "Why didn't you stop?" "I did," she snapped, then caught herself. Her voice dropped. "I cleaned it. I didn't have anything else." Gideon nodded once. He believed her. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who did everything they knew how to do and still came up short. He cleaned the wound with warm water and whiskey, ignoring Eli's whimpering protests, then rewrapped it with clean cloth. The dog stood close, nose twitching, eyes fixed on the boy, emitting a low, steady sound that was not quite a growl, not quite a whine. It was concern. "Stay," Gideon told the dog. It stayed. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Eli drifted in and out of sleep, feverish and weak. Mara sat in the corner of the room, back against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't cry. She didn't leave. She watched Gideon work with the sharp focus of someone memorizing survival skills. By midday, Gideon stepped outside to draw water from the well. When he turned back, he saw someone on the road. The man approached on horseback at an unhurried pace, as if time bent around him. He was tall and lean, dressed neatly for the territory, a dark coat, clean boots, wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His beard was trimmed close, brown with just a hint of gray at the edges, and his jaw was angular, sharp enough to suggest discipline or calculation. When he smiled, it looked practiced. Gideon recognized him only vaguely, not local. The man reined in near the fence and tipped his hat. "Afternoon." "Morning," Gideon replied. "Name's Rafe." "Calder," the man said. "I work out of Briar Ridge." Briar Ridge lay 2 counties over, too far for casual visits. "What brings you here?" Gideon asked. Calder's eyes flicked briefly toward the house, then back. "I'm looking for 2 kids, brother and sister. Ran off after their folks passed. Their uncle's worried sick." Gideon's grip tightened on the well handle. "Lots of kids passing through these days." "True," Calder agreed easily. "But these 2 are particular." The dog stepped into view behind Gideon, posture stiff. Calder noticed it and paused, studying the animal with a careful look. "That your dog?" Calder asked. "No," Gideon said. "But he's got good instincts." Calder smiled faintly. "So do I." The silence stretched. Calder didn't press. He didn't need to. He simply nodded once, tipped his hat again, and turned his horse back toward the road. "If you hear anything," he said, "there's a reward." Gideon watched until the man disappeared. That afternoon, Eli's fever worsened. By evening, his breathing was shallow, his skin damp. Gideon sat beside the bed, changing cloths, counting breaths. Mara dozed fitfully nearby, exhaustion finally catching her. The dog lay at the foot of the bed, unmoving. Gideon understood then that this was no longer a matter of shelter. Something had crossed a line. He had opened his door, yes. But now he had opened something else, something heavier. Outside, the sky darkened, and Jericho Falls settled into another cold night. Inside, Gideon Cross stayed awake, listening to a child fight for breath, and realizing, with quiet certainty, that morning would not bring an easy choice. The fever did not break by morning. Gideon Cross knew the signs well enough to dislike how familiar they felt. Eli's skin stayed hot and damp, his breathing shallow, his eyes drifting open only long enough to lose focus again. When the boy spoke, the words made little sense, fragments pulled from dreams and memory. Gideon changed the cloth at Eli's foot, kept water at his lips, and measured the hours by the sound of the kettle reheating on the stove. Mara did not leave the room. She sat against the wall near the bed, knees drawn up, arms wrapped tight around herself. She watched Gideon work without interrupting, memorizing each movement, each decision. In the clearer light of day, Gideon could see that she was thinner than she had seemed the night before. Hunger had sharpened her face, but it had not dulled her attention. Every time Eli stirred, her body leaned forward before her mind could decide. "You should eat," Gideon said quietly at one point. "I will," Mara replied, though she did not move. The German shepherd lay stretched across the foot of the bed, its head near Eli's ankles, careful not to touch the injured foot. The dog's eyes followed Gideon constantly. When Gideon stepped away to fetch more water, the dog rose and shifted closer to the boy, placing its body between Eli and the open space of the room. Gideon had seen guard dogs before. This was different. This was deliberate. By late morning, Gideon made a decision he had hoped to avoid. "I'm going to town," he said. Mara looked up sharply. "You're leaving?" "Only for a few hours," Gideon replied. "I'll get medicine. If there's a doctor who'll ride out, I'll bring him." "We don't have money," Mara said at once. Gideon met her eyes. "I didn't ask." She hesitated, then nodded. "I'll stay here." "You stay with him," Gideon said. "If his breathing changes, if the fever spikes, you wake him. Don't let him sink too deep." Mara swallowed and nodded again. She was used to instructions, used to being responsible. Gideon saddled his horse and rode toward Jericho Falls under a sky that had gone flat and pale, the kind that pressed down rather than opened up. The town moved at its usual slow pace. People nodded to him as he passed, noting the urgency in his posture without asking questions. At the general store, he found Mrs. Helen Pierce behind the counter. She was a short, sturdy woman in her early 60s, hair pulled into a tight gray bun, glasses hanging on a chain at her chest. She had lived in Jericho Falls all her life and carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had buried more people than she cared to count. "You look like trouble found you," Helen said. "Kid's sick," Gideon replied. "Bad foot. Fever." Helen's expression changed at once. "How old?" "8. She nodded and turned without another word, pulling supplies from behind the counter. "You clean the wound?" "Yes." "You keep it elevated?" "As much as he'll allow." She slid a small bottle across the counter. "This will help. Not a miracle, but it'll give him a chance." Gideon hesitated. "Anyone in town ride?" Helen studied him. "Doc Harris moved east last winter. Closest now is Briar Ridge." Gideon's jaw tightened. He paid, thanked her, and turned to leave. As he stepped outside, he saw Rafe Calder again. Calder stood near the hitching post, leaning casually against the railing, as if he'd been there all along. In daylight, Gideon could see him more clearly. He was lean and well-groomed, with sharp cheekbones and a narrow nose. His beard was trimmed close, his coat clean despite the dust. There was confidence in his posture, but also patience, the kind that came from believing time would eventually deliver what you wanted. "Morning again," Calder said. "You don't waste time," Gideon replied. Calder smiled faintly. "Neither do sick kids." The words landed heavier than they should have. "You find who you're looking for?" Gideon asked. "Not yet," Calder said. "But I will." Gideon held his gaze. "You're far from your county." Calder shrugged. "Family matters travel." The silence stretched, thick with implication. Finally, Calder tipped his hat. "Hope the boy pulls through," he said, and walked away. Gideon rode hard back to the ranch. When he arrived, the house was too quiet. He dismounted quickly and pushed inside. Mara looked up from the bedside, her face pale but controlled. "He woke up," she said. "Didn't know where he was." Gideon checked Eli. The fever was still there, but it had stopped climbing. He gave the medicine slowly, watching for any reaction. That night was worse than the last. Eli thrashed in his sleep, muttering words neither Gideon nor Mara recognized. At one point, he tried to sit up and cried out in pain, confusion flashing across his face. Mara held his shoulders, speaking to him softly, steady and calm despite the tremor in her voice. The dog did not leave the room. When Eli cried out, it pressed its body closer to the bed, grounding, present. Sometime before dawn, the fever broke. It wasn't sudden. It faded, inch by inch, like a tide retreating. Gideon felt it first in the cooling of Eli's skin, then saw it in the slowing of his breathing. When Eli finally slept, it was deep and quiet. Mara sagged against the wall, exhaustion finally winning. By morning, the sky was clear again. Gideon made coffee. Mara drank it this time without hesitation. "Thank you," she said. Gideon nodded. "He's not out of danger, but he's better." She watched Eli sleep for a long moment. "We shouldn't stay," she said finally. Gideon turned toward her. "Why?" "That man," Mara said. "He's not law. He's working for someone. And if he's looking here, he'll come back." Gideon studied her. "Who's he working for?" Mara hesitated, then spoke. Our uncle, Von Wren. Gideon said nothing. He wanted our parents' land, Mara continued. When they refused, the barn burned. They didn't make it out. The words were flat, practiced. They had been carried too long. We ran that night, she said. We've been running since. Gideon felt the familiar tightening in his chest. You think Calder's paid? I know he is. The dog lifted its head, ears alert, as if the sound of the name had weight. Mara looked at Gideon then, really looked. If we leave now, you won't be in danger. Gideon considered the house, the quiet, the way Eli's breathing filled the room where silence had ruled for years. No, he said. Mara blinked. What? You leave now. He'll follow, Gideon said. You stay. We prepare. She searched his face for doubt and found none. You don't owe us this, she said. I'm not doing it because I owe you, Gideon replied. I'm doing it because running hasn't worked. Mara exhaled slowly. She nodded once. Okay. Outside, the dog rose and walked to Gideon's side, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Gideon rested a hand on its head. Guess you're staying too. The dog's tail moved once. By evening, Gideon knew one thing for certain. This had stopped being about shelter. It was about choice, and he had made his. The ranch did not return to silence after the fever broke. It changed its sound. Eli slept long and deep through most of the morning, his breathing steady now, the sharp edge gone from it. Gideon kept checking the boy's temperature with the back of his hand, not because he expected it to rise again, but because habits built during fear didn't leave easily. The infection in the foot still worried him. The swelling had eased slightly, but the skin remained tender and red. Healing, Gideon knew, was rarely quick and never polite. Mara finally allowed herself to step outside while Eli slept. She stood on the porch, arms folded, scanning the open land beyond the fence as if expecting movement. In daylight, she looked younger than she acted. The hard lines in her posture softened when she wasn't actively guarding her brother, but the alertness never left her eyes. She had learned, long before she should have, that rest was temporary. Gideon joined her, leaning against the porch post. You don't have to watch the road every minute, he said. Mara didn't look at him. It's how you stay ahead. Sometimes, Gideon replied. Other times it's how you miss what's right next to you. She considered that without answering. Behind them, the German shepherd trotted into the yard, moving with quiet confidence. In the daylight, Gideon could see more detail, a faint scar along the dog's flank, fur grown back unevenly, suggesting an old injury that had healed without care. The animal's build was strong and athletic despite its lean frame. It paused near the fence, nose low, scenting the ground, then circled back toward the house as if checking boundaries. It did this several times, methodical and deliberate. He's been doing that since sunrise, Mara said. Like he's mapping the place. That's exactly what he's doing, Gideon replied. Used to belong to someone who worked him. Mara glanced at the dog. You think he was a ranch dog? Or law enforcement, Gideon said. Either way, he's trained. As if in response, the dog sat near Eli's window, back straight, ears forward, watching the yard. Gideon exhaled. I should give him a name. Mara hesitated, then said, Kaiser. Gideon looked at her. Why Kaiser? She shrugged. He stands like one. The dog's tail thumped once, restrained approval. The rest of the day passed with a quiet tension that never fully lifted. Gideon showed Mara where the well bucket was kept and how the pump worked. She followed instructions carefully, absorbing information with the seriousness of someone who knew knowledge could mean survival. When Gideon began repairing a loose board on the barn, Mara fetched tools without being asked. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was trying to be useful, a habit built from necessity. Eli woke in the afternoon, confused but calmer. He drank water and managed a few bites of bread. When he smiled weakly, Baesat, Mara, her shoulders dropped just enough for Gideon to notice. Can I go outside? Eli asked. Not yet, Gideon said, but you can sit by the door. Eli nodded. He accepted limits more easily than Gideon expected, as if exhaustion had stripped away the need to argue. Kaiser lay beside him, close but careful. When Eli leaned forward, the dog adjusted, giving space without moving away. Late in the afternoon, Gideon noticed dust on the far road. He lifted his binoculars and scanned the distance. A rider moved slowly along the ridgeline, too far to identify, but deliberate in pace. Gideon watched until the figure disappeared behind a rise. Mara saw the tension in his posture. "Is it him?" "Not sure," Gideon said. "Could be anyone." But neither of them believed that. That evening, Gideon cooked a proper meal. Meat, potatoes, bread. It wasn't celebration, it was preparation. They ate together at the table, and for the first time, Eli spoke more than a few words at a time, asking simple questions about the horses, about the barn, about the dog. "Kaiser's old?" Eli asked. "Middle-aged," Gideon said. "Like me." Kaiser lifted his head at the sound of his name, then settled again. After dinner, Gideon stepped outside to secure the perimeter. He checked the gate, the barn doors, the back fence where the wire dipped low. Kaiser followed, silent and focused. When Gideon stopped, the dog stopped. When Gideon knelt to inspect a track in the dirt, Kaiser circled wide, scanning. "You're not wrong to be careful," Gideon murmured. As they rounded the barn, Gideon noticed fresh hoofprints near the edge of the property. Not old, not deep enough to suggest a stop, but close enough to send a message. Someone had been watching. That night, Gideon laid out ground rules. "You don't wander," he told Mara. "Not you, not Eli. If someone comes, you go upstairs, back of the closet. There's space behind the wall panel." Mara listened closely. "And you?" "I'll handle the talking," she frowned. "You can't handle everything alone." Gideon met her gaze. "I've been doing it a long time." "That doesn't mean you should." He didn't argue. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the truth without yielding ground. Later, when the lamps were low, Gideon sat at the table cleaning his rifle, movements practiced and calm. Mara watched from the stairs. "You planning for trouble?" she asked. "I'm planning not to be surprised." She hesitated, then came down and sat across from him. "If things go bad," she said carefully, "we can still leave." Gideon looked at her, really looked. "And then what?" She didn't answer. Upstairs, Eli slept. Kaiser lay at the foot of the stairs, alert but still. Outside, the land stretched quiet and open, hiding its intentions. Gideon finished cleaning the rifle and set it aside. He poured himself a cup of coffee, though he knew he wouldn't drink much of it. "We'll take this one day at a time," he said. Mara nodded. It wasn't agreement. It was acceptance. As the night deepened, Gideon understood something clearly for the first time. Danger was coming whether they ran or stayed. The difference was who would be standing when it arrived. And Gideon Cross had already chosen his place. The knock came just after noon. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was the kind of knock that assumed the door would open, the kind delivered by someone who believed time and authority worked in his favor. Gideon heard it from the barn and knew, before he straightened, that the waiting had ended. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out into the yard. Kaiser was already there, standing near the porch, body still, ears forward. The dog had not barked. It rarely did. Gideon had come to understand that silence, with Kaiser, meant certainty. Rafe Calder stood at the door, hat in hand, sunlight catching the edges of his face. Up close, his features were sharper than Gideon remembered. His cheekbones were high, his jaw narrow and defined, the beard along it trimmed with care rather than necessity. He looked like a man who paid attention to details, including the way others reacted to him. His coat was clean, his boots recently oiled, and the revolver at his hip sat comfortably, as if it had been worn long enough to feel like part of him. Behind him, farther back near the fence, waited another man. This one stayed mounted. He was broader, heavier through the shoulders, with a thick neck and a beard gone wild with neglect. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes that did not wander. He did not smile. He did not speak. He watched. "Afternoon, Gideon," Calder said easily. "Mind if I come in?" Gideon stopped a few steps short of the porch. "I do mind." Calder's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes cooled. "That's a shame." Kaiser shifted his weight, placing himself slightly forward, a silent barrier between the house and the men. Calder noticed. His gaze lingered on the dog for a moment longer than before. "You keeping strays now?" Calder asked. "Seems one found me," Gideon replied. Calder nodded as if filing that away. "I won't take much of your time. I've been asking around. Turns out you're the last place those kids might have passed through." "Lots of people pass through here," Gideon said. "True," Calder agreed, "but not many stop." The mounted man behind him cleared his throat, a low, rough sound. Calder lifted a hand without looking back, silencing him. It was a practiced gesture. The man obeyed. "That boy," Calder continued, voice calm, conversational. "Eli, he's sick, isn't he?" Gideon felt the words land like a hand on his chest. "You don't know that." Calder shrugged. "Kids traveling alone tend to get sick. Happens fast." Behind Gideon, a floorboard creaked. He didn't turn, but he knew Mara was listening from the hallway, knew she would be standing straight, eyes sharp, ready to act if needed. Eli, at least, was asleep. "You've said what you came to say," Gideon said. "Now you can leave." Calder studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed, as if disappointed. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He held it up just long enough for Gideon to see the official-looking stamp. "Missing persons notice," he said. "Signed by the boy's legal guardian." Gideon didn't take it. "You know," Calder went on, "there's a reward, enough to fix that barn of yours proper, maybe even replace it." The mounted man shifted in the saddle, leather creaking. He smiled then, a slow, unpleasant curl of the mouth that showed yellowed teeth beneath the beard. Gideon felt something settle inside him, cold and solid. "You're not law," he said, "and you're not welcome." Calder's expression hardened just slightly. "I am law enough where it counts." Kaiser growled then, low, controlled. The sound carried weight. Calder took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "All right," he said. "No need to get dramatic. I'll be around." He tipped his hat, turned, and walked back toward his horse. The mounted man followed, eyes never leaving Gideon until the last possible moment. Gideon stood where he was until the dust settled. Inside, Mara waited by the stairs. She was pale, but steady. "They're not done," she said. "No," Gideon replied. "They're just starting." That afternoon, Gideon rode out to see his nearest neighbor, a man named Jacob Miller. Jacob lived 5 miles down the valley in a low house tucked against a stand of cottonwoods. He was in his late 60s, tall and spare, with a long gray beard and eyes that missed very little. Years earlier, a ranch accident had taken part of his hearing and most of his patience. Since then, Jacob spoke only when he meant it. Jacob listened without interrupting, hands resting on the fence rail as Gideon spoke. "You sure he's not law?" Jacob asked finally. "Sure enough." Jacob nodded once. "I'll keep an eye out." "I'd appreciate it." Jacob studied him. "You taking this on alone?" Gideon didn't answer right away. "I wasn't planning to." Jacob's mouth twitched. "Good." When Gideon returned, the sun was already dropping. Mara was in the kitchen, carefully washing dishes. Eli sat at the table, color returned to his face, Kaiser lying at his feet. "How was town?" Mara asked. "Quiet," Gideon said. "For now." That night, the tension sharpened. Gideon moved through the house, checking locks, window, angles of sight. He showed Mara again where the hiding space was, made her practice opening and closing the panel silently. She did it without complaint. Eli watched from the bed. "Are they bad men?" he asked. "Yes," Gideon said, "but not unbeatable." Eli nodded, satisfied. After dark, Kaiser went rigid. Gideon felt it before he saw it. The dog's body stiffened, ears locked forward, head turning slowly toward the back of the property. Gideon lifted his rifle and stepped onto the porch. 2 shapes moved near the tree line. Not close, not yet, just enough to be seen. A warning. Gideon raised the Tutatund rifle and fired once into the air. The figures froze, then retreated. The message was clear. Later, as the house settled, Mara sat at the table with Gideon. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. Gideon met her gaze. "Yes, I did." She hesitated. "Why?" He thought of the quiet years, the empty house, the way silence had almost swallowed him whole. "Because some lines don't move," he said. Mara nodded. She understood that kind of line. Upstairs, Eli slept. Kaiser lay at the foot of the stairs, eyes open. Outside, the land waited, and Gideon Cross knew the next knock wouldn't be polite. The next morning arrived without apology. Gideon Cross woke before first light, the habit older than the ranch itself. The house was quiet but not empty. It held the low sounds of breathing upstairs, the faint creak of wood settling, the presence of another heartbeat that wasn't his. He moved carefully, boots in hand, until he reached the kitchen, then sat and pulled them on while the kettle warmed. Outside, the land lay pale and still, the kind of stillness that made a man listen harder. Kaiser was already awake. The dog sat near the back door, head angled toward the tree line, ears tracking sounds too distant for Gideon to catch. In the gray half-light, Kaiser's posture looked carved rather than relaxed, balanced, alert, ready. Gideon had come to trust that stance more than his own instincts. Upstairs, Mara stirred when Gideon stepped onto the porch. She followed a minute later, wrapping a jacket around herself, hair pulled back quickly, eyes scanning the yard. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Enough," Gideon replied. Eli woke later, moving carefully, foot still sore but improving. He leaned on the doorframe and watched Gideon check the fence line. "Is today a bad day?" he asked. Gideon considered the question. "Not if we do it right." That morning, Gideon rode out again, this time farther than Jacob Miller's place. He followed the valley road toward the Dunn Spread, a low, wide ranch set near a bend in the creek where cottonwoods grew thick. Hazel Dunn met him at the gate. She was in her late 50s, tall for a woman, with a strong back and weathered hands. Her hair, once dark, had gone iron gray and was cut short for practicality. She wore men's boots and a faded jacket that smelled of horse and oil. Hazel had lost her husband to a riding accident 10 years earlier and had learned to manage the land alone. People said she had little patience and excellent aim. Both were true. "You look like trouble followed you home," Hazel said, resting her forearms on the gate. "Something like that," Gideon replied. He told her what he could, leaving out names but not the threat. Hazel listened without interrupting, eyes narrowed against the sun. "I've seen that man," she said when Gideon finished. "Clean coat. Wrong smile." "He's not done," Gideon said. Hazel nodded. "Neither am I." She called toward the barn, where a figure moved in shadow. "Boone!" Boone Carver stepped into the light. He was older than Gideon by a few years, broad through the shoulders, with a thick white beard that he kept untrimmed. His left hand was stiff and curled from an old injury, the result of a logging accident that had cost him 3 fingers. Boone spoke slowly and rarely, not because he lacked words, but because he didn't waste them. "What's needed?" Boone asked. "Eyes," Gideon said. "And time." Boone nodded. "You'll have both." By noon, Gideon had spoken to 2 more neighbors, quiet men who worked their land and minded their business until business came for them. No promises were made aloud, but Gideon didn't need them. He recognized readiness when he saw it. When he returned to the ranch, Mara was in the yard splitting kindling under Kaiser's watchful eye. She worked carefully, shoulders tense but steady. Eli sat on a crate nearby, whittling a stick with a small knife Gideon had given him, supervised and slow. "They'll come back," Mara said when Gideon dismounted. "Yes," Gideon replied, "and not alone." She nodded. "What do we do?" Gideon looked around the property, measuring lines of sight, distances, angles. "We don't hide," he said. "We make it clear." That afternoon became work. Gideon set Mara to helping him clear brush near the fence to open the approach. He showed her where to stand if she needed cover, how to move quietly between structures. She learned fast, not because she wanted to fight, but because she understood preparation. Kaiser ranged wider than usual, circling the perimeter in long, even sweeps. Once he stopped near the back fence and lowered his head, sniffing. He returned to Gideon and sat, eyes fixed on the trees. "Tracks?" Mara asked. "Recent," Gideon said. "They're testing." As dusk approached, Gideon did one thing he hadn't planned to do. He gathered Mara and Eli in the kitchen and spoke plainly. "If it turns bad," he said, "you go upstairs. You don't come out until I say." Mara's jaw tightened. "You don't get to do this alone." "I won't be," Gideon said. "But you don't need to be in the way." Eli looked between them. "I can be quiet," he said seriously. Gideon met his eyes. "I know you can." The first rider appeared at sunset. He didn't come down the road. He appeared at the edge of the field, outlined against the dying light. Then another, then a third. They stopped short of the fence, watching. Rafe Calder rode forward alone. He looked different now. The careful politeness was gone, replaced by something sharper. His coat was still clean, his beard still trimmed, but his posture had shifted, weight forward, hands closer to his belt. He reined in and waited, as if expecting Gideon to come to him. Gideon didn't. Calder called out, voice carrying easily, "We can still do this clean." "There's nothing clean about you," Gideon replied. Calder smiled thinly. "I warned you." He raised a hand. One of the men behind him dismounted and began walking the fence line, slow and deliberate. Another stayed mounted, scanning the buildings. Kaiser moved first. The dog stepped forward into full view, body stiff, teeth bared. He did not charge. He held the line. Calder's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Gideon. "That animal won't save you." "No," Gideon said. "But he'll warn me." The man at the fence bent, reaching for the wire. Gideon fired once, the shot snapping through the air and burying itself in the dirt, a foot from the man's hand. The man froze. Calder's smile vanished. "You're making this worse." Gideon didn't respond. He kept the rifle steady. From the trees to the west, another sound rose, the creak of saddle leather. Jacob Miller rode out first, hat low, rifle across his chest. Hazel Dunn followed, reins loose in one hand, shotgun resting easy in the other. Boone Carver appeared behind them, silent as a fence post. Calder looked around, calculating. The odds had shifted. "This isn't your fight," Calder said, trying for control. Hazel's voice carried from her saddle. "It is when you bring it to our valley." The standoff stretched, taut and dangerous. Calder made a choice. He raised his hand slowly. "Not today," he said. "But soon." He turned his horse and rode off. The others followed, slower now, watched from every angle. When they were gone, the land seemed to exhale. Mara came out onto the porch, hands shaking despite herself. Eli followed, leaning against the doorframe. Gideon lowered the rifle. Hazel rode closer. "He won't stop," she said. "I know," Gideon replied. Jacob nodded. "Neither will we." Night fell with an uneasy calm. The neighbors didn't stay long. They didn't need to. Their presence had been the message. Inside, Gideon sat at the table, cleaning the rifle again. Mara brought him coffee without being asked. Eli sat nearby, quiet, eyes wide but steady. Kaiser lay between them, head on his paws, watchful. Gideon understood then that the line had been drawn. Not in words, not in threats, but in who showed up and who didn't back down. This wasn't over, but it had begun to take shape. And Gideon Cross knew that whatever came next, it would come to a place that was no longer standing alone. The calm after Calder's retreat did not feel like relief. It felt like a held breath. Gideon Cross understood that kind of quiet. It was the space men left themselves when they were deciding how far they were willing to go. The ranch settled into a careful rhythm over the next 2 days. Every sound noted, every movement measured. No one pretended the danger had passed. They behaved as if it had simply stepped out of sight. Eli continued to improve, slowly but steadily. He could walk short distances now, favoring the injured foot, his face regaining color that Gideon had not seen since the boy arrived. The fever stayed away, though Gideon kept the medicine close and watched for signs that might say otherwise. Eli tried to be useful, insisted on small tasks, holding tools, feeding the chickens, counting fence posts as if numbers themselves could keep fear in line. He asked fewer questions than before, but when he did speak, it was with a seriousness that suggested he understood more than adults gave him credit for. Mara changed too. The constant edge in her posture softened just slightly, replaced by something more dangerous than fear: resolve. She worked alongside Gideon without being asked, learning the property as if it were a map she intended to remember forever. She asked practical questions: where shadows fell at dusk, which doors stuck, which windows rattled in high wind. She didn't talk about leaving anymore. Kaiser stayed close to the house, but his patrols grew wider. He ranged the fence line in steady arcs, nose low, ears forward, checking the same points again and again. Once, Gideon watched him stop at the back gate and sit, staring into the trees without moving for a long minute. Gideon didn't ask why. He trusted the silence. On the third morning, Jacob Miller rode in unannounced. His horse was lathered, breathing hard, and Jacob himself looked more tense than usual, jaw set beneath his long gray beard. He dismounted stiffly, favoring his left side, and nodded once at Gideon. "They're moving," Jacob said. "Not just Calder, others." "How many?" Gideon asked. "Hard to say. 2 camps set up along the ridge road, men coming and going, armed." Mara, who had been splitting kindling nearby, went still. Eli looked up from where he sat on the porch step. Jacob glanced at the children, then back to Gideon. "They're waiting for something." "They won't wait long," Gideon said. Jacob nodded. "Hazel's already riding out to Boone. Folks are talking." That afternoon, Hazel Dunn arrived with Boone Carver and another man Gideon hadn't met before. The newcomer introduced himself as Thomas Reed. He was in his early 40s, broad-backed and thick through the arms, with a dark beard worn long and streaked with premature gray. A scar cut across his right cheek, pale and straight. He spoke quietly and chose his words carefully, the manner of a man who had learned that talk could get you killed if you weren't. Precise. Years earlier, Gideon learned later, Reed had lost his brother to hired men in a land dispute not unlike this one. It had changed the way he looked at authority. "They won't push during daylight," Reed said, standing near the barn, eyes scanning the tree line. "They'll come at night or just before. Confusion works better then." Hazel nodded. "And they'll try to separate you from the kids." Mara lifted her chin. "They won't." Hazel studied her for a moment, then said, "Good." Plans were made without ceremony. No one talked about heroics. They talked about angles, cover, lines of retreat. Gideon showed them the lay of the land, the shallow dips and blind spots. Boone listened with his head tilted, committing it all to memory. Jacob checked sightlines from the road. Reed walked the fence, measuring distances with long strides. By evening, the sky darkened with low clouds, the kind that pressed down and made sound travel strangely. The air smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Gideon took that as a warning. "Tonight," Hazel said quietly. Gideon nodded. He gathered Mara and Eli in the house as dusk settled. "This is how it goes," he said. "If they come, you go upstairs. You do exactly what we practiced." Mara met his eyes. "You're not sending us away." "I'm sending you to safety," Gideon replied. Eli swallowed. "Will they hurt you?" Gideon rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Not if they know what's good for them." That wasn't entirely true, but it was enough. The first shot came after dark. It wasn't aimed at the house. It struck the fence post near the back field, splintering wood and sending a clear message. Gideon was already moving when Kaiser stiffened, a low warning rumble vibrating through his chest. "Go," Gideon said. Mara took Eli's hand and pulled him toward the stairs without argument. Kaiser followed them halfway, then stopped, turning back to Gideon as if asking permission. "Stay," Gideon said. "Guard." The dog obeyed. Outside, shadows moved, more than before. Gideon could hear them now. Boots and grass, murmured voices, the clink of metal. Hazel's shape appeared near the barn, shotgun ready. Boone took position near the fence line. Jacob and Reed moved along the tree edge, slow and deliberate. Rafe Calder stepped into view, illuminated briefly by the porch light. He no longer bothered with a smile. "This doesn't have to end badly," Calder called out. Gideon didn't answer. Calder raised a hand. 2 men advanced, rifles low but ready. One was the bearded man Gideon had seen before. The other was younger, lean, nervous energy twitching through his movements. They didn't make it far. Hazel fired first, the blast tearing through the night, sending the younger man sprawling. Boone's rifle cracked a second later, the sound sharp and final, and the bearded man dropped behind the fence, screaming as he hit the dirt. Chaos followed. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Gideon returned fire, controlled and precise, aiming to stop rather than kill where he could. Reed moved like a man with no wasted motion, flanking wide and cutting off retreat. Jacob held his ground, steady as stone. A bullet tore through Gideon's side, hot and blinding. He stumbled but stayed upright, gritting his teeth, forcing breath through pain. He fired again, driving the attackers back. From inside the house, a scream cut through the noise. "Mara!" Calder had moved faster than Gideon expected. He burst through the back door with another man at his side, dragging Mara into the open, a gun pressed to her head. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. "Drop it," Calder shouted, "or she dies." Gideon lowered his rifle slowly, blood soaking into his shirt. Every instinct screamed to act, to end it, but the angle was wrong. The risk was too great. "Where's the boy?" Calder demanded. Mara said nothing. Calder struck her hard across the face. She fell to her knees but didn't cry out. "Last chance," Calder said. Then a shape moved behind him. Kaiser launched from the shadows, a blur of muscle and teeth. He hit Calder's arm, clamping down with crushing force. The gun went off, the shot wild, tearing into the dirt. Calder screamed, staggering back. Reed fired. Hazel fired again. Boone advanced. Calder fell. Silence followed, broken only by labored breathing and the distant echo of hooves as the remaining men fled into the dark. Gideon collapsed to one knee, vision narrowing. Hazel reached him first, pressing cloth against the wound. "Stay with me," she said sharply. Mara crawled to him, hands shaking as she held his face. "Don't you dare," she whispered. Kaiser stood over them, chest heaving, blood on his muzzle, eyes fierce but steady. By the time dawn came, it was over. The law arrived late that morning, summoned by half the valley. They took the surviving men into custody. Calder, bleeding and unconscious, was loaded into a wagon under guard. Gideon lay in his bed, pain dull but constant. Mara sat beside him, changing bandages with careful hands. Eli watched from the doorway, silent and wide-eyed. Hazel leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "You did good," she said. Gideon closed his eyes. "Not done yet." But for the first time, he believed the worst had passed. The ranch woke slowly in the days that followed, as if the land itself needed time to understand that the fighting had ended. Gideon Cross remained in bed for nearly a week. The bullet had passed cleanly through his side, missing anything vital, but the pain lingered in deep, stubborn waves. He accepted it without complaint. Pain, at least, made sense. It came from something that had happened and would eventually pass. What unsettled him more was the quiet. How different it felt now that it was shared. Mara took charge of his care with calm determination. She cleaned the wound twice a day, her hands steady, her movements precise. In the clear morning light, Gideon noticed things he hadn't before. The faint scar at the base of her thumb from an old burn, the way her jaw tightened when she concentrated, the careful distance she kept between herself and fear. She spoke little while she worked, but when she did, it was practical. No dramatics, no self-pity. She had grown into responsibility the hard way, and it showed. Eli stayed close, sitting on the chair beside the bed, reading aloud from an old book Gideon had nearly forgotten he owned. He stumbled over words sometimes, stopped to ask questions about meaning, about what came next. His voice had grown stronger, his color better. The limp remained, but it faded a little more each day. When Gideon slept, Eli counted his breaths quietly, the way Gideon once had. Kaiser rarely left the doorway. The dog bore the marks of the fight, a shallow cut along the shoulder, already healing, and stiffness in one hind leg that made his movements slower than before. He accepted the attention Hazel Dunn insisted on giving him with patient tolerance, endured the cleaning of wounds without protest. After that, he returned to his post, settling where he could see both the stairs and the front door. He slept lightly, eyes opening at every unfamiliar sound, but his posture had changed, less rigid, less searching. He looked like an animal that had found what it was guarding. The law came properly this time. Marshal Henry Bell arrived from the county seat 3 days after the attack. He was a large man in his early 50s, thick through the middle, with a neatly trimmed mustache and tired eyes that suggested he had seen more messes than he liked to admit. He moved carefully through the property, hat in hand, listening more than he spoke. When he questioned Gideon, his tone was respectful, measured. "You did what you had to," Bell said finally. "You weren't the one who brought violence here." Bell spoke to Mara and Eli as well. He crouched to Eli's level, asked gentle questions, listened without interrupting. When Mara told the story again, about Von Wren, about the fire, about the running, Bell's expression darkened. "Von Wren won't be walking free," Bell said. "Not after this." The survivors from Calder's group were taken away in chains. Calder himself, arm heavily bandaged and pride broken beyond repair, did not look at Gideon as they loaded him into the wagon. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, a man who had lost not just a fight, but control. After the law left, the neighbors lingered. Jacob Miller repaired the damaged fence without being asked. Boone Carver replaced a shattered post near the barn, working slowly, methodically. Hazel stayed long enough to make sure Gideon ate something that wasn't broth. Thomas Reed stood with Mara near the edge of the field, pointing out where the ground dipped, where water gathered after rain. He didn't offer comfort, he offered knowledge. Mara listened, When the ranch finally settled back into its routines, it did so with more hands than before. Gideon healed, slowly, stubbornly. He returned to the porch first, sitting in the sun with a blanket over his shoulders. Kaiser stretched at his feet. From there, he watched Mara and Eli move through the yard as if they belonged. Mara repaired a loose hinge on the barn door. Eli helped feed the chickens, careful and proud of each small task. Gideon realized then that the house no longer echoed when someone spoke. Sound stayed, it lingered. One evening, as the sky turned the familiar shades of gold and rust, Mara sat beside Gideon on the porch steps. "The marshal said we could go to town," she said. "Stay with someone else until things are settled." Gideon didn't look at her. "Do you want to?" She was quiet for a long moment. "No." He nodded. "Then you'll stay." She exhaled, a breath she might have been holding for months. "For good?" "If you want," Gideon said. "This place could use people who know how to stand their ground." Mara's eyes shone, but she didn't cry. She reached over and placed her hand on his forearm, light but certain. "Thank you," she said. Eli joined them a moment later, leaning against Gideon's side without asking permission. Gideon led him. Kaiser lifted his head, adjusted and settled again, content. Weeks passed. The ranch repaired itself. Boards were replaced. The fence stood straight. The land showed no sign that blood had ever soaked into it. Winter edged closer, but the house felt warmer than it had in years. Gideon taught Eli how to read weather in the clouds, how to tell when snow would come early. He taught Mara how to sharpen tools properly, how to keep a blade true. She learned fast, her confidence growing into something solid and earned. One afternoon, Gideon found paperwork on the kitchen table. Mara stood nearby, hands folded. "Marshal Bell brought these," she said. "About guardianship." Gideon picked them up, read slowly. The words carried weight, responsibility, permanence. "You don't have to," Mara said quickly. "We can—" "I know," Gideon interrupted gently. He looked at her, then at Eli, then at Kaiser asleep in the sunlight. "But I want to." Mara swallowed hard and nodded. By the time the first snow fell, it fell. On a different ranch than the one Gideon Cross had lived on before. It fell on a place where laughter existed again, where meals were shared, where silence no longer meant absence. On the morning the papers were finalized, Hazel arrived with a pie and a grin. Jacob tipped his hat. Boone clapped Gideon once on the shoulder, careful of the healing wound. Even Thomas Reed allowed himself a small smile. Kaiser sat at Gideon's side through it all, older now, movements slower but sure. A scar traced his shoulder, a mark of something survived rather than something lost. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Gideon stood on the porch with Mara and Eli. The valley stretched wide and quiet, no longer threatening, just vast. "You saved us," Eli said softly. Gideon shook his head. "No," he replied. "You stayed." Mara smiled at that, a real smile, unguarded. Inside, the house glowed warm against the cold, and for the first time in many years, Gideon Cross did not feel like he was waiting for something to end. He felt like something had finally begun. Sometimes, miracles don't come with light or thunder. They come quietly, through ordinary people who choose to stay when it would be easier to walk away. Through hands that protect instead of harm. Through a home that opens its door when the world keeps closing theirs. This story reminds us that God often works through compassion, courage, and small acts of kindness. A meal shared. A child kept safe. An animal that refuses to abandon those it loves. In our daily lives, we may never face danger like this, but every day we are given the same choice: to care, to stand up, to be someone else's shelter. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you. And if you believe that no child, no soul, and no living creature should ever face fear alone, subscribe to this channel so we can keep sharing stories like this together. May God bless you, protect your home, and walk with you through every quiet miracle still ahead.